Good morning. Uh, what a great week we've had already. And you who've asked, my foot is getting better slowly. The doctor said this kind of a thing is pitifully slow. He said the worst part of it is how slow it is at healing up. But last night we enjoyed hearing Brother Dave Ward and his wife have been in Cambodia for many years, an amazing ministry, working with the Cambodian people. They're out of Brother Esposito's church, now Brother Steve Meyer's church in Long Beach Pacific Baptist, right in almost downtown Long Beach, I guess you'd call it. But what a great church. And they've got beautiful new facilities opened up. And I'm so thankful for them. They are a testimony of steadfastness, of faithfulness to the gospel, faithfulness to the calling of God, and to the Great Commission to bring the gospel to the world. We're going to be in Isaiah. Well, actually, we'll be in Genesis 18 in a couple of minutes, and then in Psalms 106. But I wanted to take a minute and read a verse or two for you, or a little line or two from this book on, this is the Imprisoned Preachers and Religious Liberty. And again, I just want to keep reminding you how blessed we are and how at risk we are. Understand this, we have no guarantee of liberty. Although our Constitution guarantees it, although our Bill of Rights guarantees it, everything about our national roots guarantees us liberty. But as public opinion changes, as our schools, our high schools and colleges, and even elementary schools have totally twisted the minds of so much of society, it'll come to a point where society will outvote the Constitution, and they won't care about the rights to the free exercise of religion. And that the country around us, very possible, unless God brings us some revival, we won't have any rights, because the rights we have guaranteed can certainly be taken away by the multitude. And it shouldn't be if we're going to be a constitutional republic. But when you've got a bunch of people who've been taught the Constitution is out of date, and that it was put together by a bunch of prejudiced, bigoted old white guys, you get that kind of talk going on. It's a mess. It never occurs to them that it's the first time in the world that there was freedom, religious freedom, and the first time in the history of the world when a nation actually went to war to defend the freedoms of all of its citizens. Nobody, people talk about socialism, but why don't they move to Venezuela or move to Russia or move to New Zealand with an 80% tax rate or some crazy thing like that? I love America. Now it's headed down, but we know where we're going. We're headed up. But I do want to encourage you. We should remember who we are, where we are. There's just a couple of lines from 1768. We subscribed. This a list of names, and this was to the court in Amelia. We subscribers do humbly pray that your worship would favor us so far as to license George Walton's house as a place for those dissenters called separate Baptists to assemble and preach. Therefore, humbly submit in this consideration to your worship, hoping you will in mercy grant the same to us who are in duty bound to always pray for all authorities under God and over us. And there's a list of names. And it was rejected on the 24th of November, about a month later, 1768. It goes on talking about some people involved in it. In 1769, Jeremiah Walker was sued in 2 actions by the court in Lunenburg for baptizing Henry and Brian Lester. The father of the boys sued. Now, these boys are, at least one of them was 18 years old. The grounds for the lawsuit, they were underage. So they were petitioning the right to meet, but they were still going to meet. And they were trying to get the laws to be fair for all religious people, but they were still doing what they were doing. And Mr. Edwards, in another history book, one Lester brought against him, meaning Jeremiah Walker, 2 actions for baptizing his sons. The plea was that they were underage, and the father withdrew the action, but threw the cost on Walker. And I don't know what cost, maybe court costs or whatever. One of the youths, Henry Lester, became a prominent preacher in Appomattox Association, an association of Baptist churches. Semple's history from 1810 under the heading of the Ash Camp Church has this reference to him. This is one of the boys who was baptized too young. Ash Camp is a young but prosperous church. It was raised under the ministerial labors of Reverend Henry Lester, who was their pastor until 1808. He then moved to the Western country. Mr. Lester embraced religion at a very early period of the rise of the Baptists when he was about 18 years of age. So this is an 18-year-old young man, and doesn't list the age of his brother, but the two trusted Christ and wanted to follow the Lord in baptism, though it was against the law. He soon began to preach and was acceptable as a young preacher. Marrying, however, when quite young, his ministerial labors were somewhat curtailed. So their view of marriage was a weight. As the Apostle Paul said, he that's single cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord, but he that's married cares for the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And that's just how it is. Marrying, it says he continued to blow the gospel trumpet, but not to such extent as some who were less entangled with the affairs of this life. He is now about 57 years of age, of good constitution, and a point of talents as a preacher. Mr. Lester may be considered as occupying a respectable grade. The previous year, 1772, Jeremiah Walker extended his labors down the Virginia Peninsula, preaching among the people who afterwards formed James City Church, which was located in the upper part of James City County. The church that they were much opposed by the parsons of the parish and others, and that his preaching, he was in trouble, basically. Just a thought, just to understand, we're misfits. A couple of days ago, I talked about this. We don't fit. We don't belong. Our philosophies, our ideas, as a people of God, they crucified our Savior. Remember, they killed Jesus. This world's not going to embrace us. And the more this world gets away from the Bible, and the more we cling to the Bible, the further apart we're going to be. And the world around us is not forgiving. They talk about tolerance and accepting everybody, but they're not accepting of anybody who's different than them. They want us to accept everybody, and they're not about to accept us. And it's a world where if you're not like them, they're going to burn your house down or rock your car or key your car. And I have a friend years ago in Bangalore, India, and he had a group of his young people in his Bible college down in another city, and they just took their bus down, and they were just on the street going soul winning and preaching and hoping that they might be able to start a church in that city. And they came back, and their bus had been knocked over. A group of enough people hated what they were doing that they got a hold of that bus and rocked it. Maybe they had some heavy equipment, but they took that bus and just dumped it over. Now, when there's 30 or 40 of you and your bus is on its side, what do? How do you get it back up? And just understand, if we face some opposition, if people, this guy's being drug into court for baptizing, and that's happened in America. I've got a couple of friends who've had to face that. And, we have to have a parent's signature before we baptize a minor. We don't have to, we just choose to. But understand this, the affections and the fondness of this world, that is reserved for the people of the world, not the people from that world. We don't belong here. We truly are of a different world. And I don't like it, but I want to say to you, we should accept it and go on about our business. But it's no fun. No one likes being on the outside. And we all would love to be apart with things. My neighbors, none of my neighbors, there's 5 other houses on my street, and I've never seen any of them go to church anywhere. We've talked to them. We've invited them to church. One of the neighbors has come one time, and another neighbor at the end of our street came one time. But we've talked to our neighbors. We have good fruit trees. We share our fruit with them and stuff. And we're very cordial and friendly. But, they're at this point not feeling like they need church or our church or any church, I guess. But we can be gracious friends. But, that's not how the world is. This world around us, they want to destroy anybody who is a threat to them. So with that in mind, I want to mention just a couple of things. In Genesis 18:23, just a couple of thoughts here as we look this morning. And again, if you weren't able to be a part of things last night, hopefully it's online. But Pastor Board, brother missionary Dave Board and his wife Debbie, they're just an amazing couple. And they've been for many years working with the Cambodian people. And they are, I'm talking about interceding today. And they have spent their life interceding on behalf of a people that most of the world doesn't care about. And when I started the church, not long after the Brother Esposito started Pacific Baptist, it was Cambodian Baptist, and they were all Cambodians. And they came, and I heard their testimonies, young teenagers' testimonies, how their parents were killed. And these were boat people. These were the people back in the day when they would kill anybody who was educated was killed, anybody who was a professional was killed. They put the kids to work in the fields, rice paddies, and they said one at a time they'd slip out of the rice paddy when no one was looking. They'd roll over rocks and logs, and whatever moved they'd throw in their mouths and eat it, and they'd run back into the field. Then another kid would do it, and that's how these kids stayed alive. And they got on a boat and floated out into the ocean just hoping. And now some of the adults in that church, they were the teenagers in our camps. We shared camps with them, and these are great people. And the board spent their life interceding. Well, this thing interceding is to see somebody in trouble or somebody in need and to go to God on their behalf. Well, Abraham, called the friend of God. He had a nephew down in Sodom, and he shouldn't have been there. He was in the wrong place. He was in the wrong place with the wrong people, but Abraham still loved him. And Abraham knew that God told him he's going to destroy the place. And so Abraham began to intercede. And so in verse 23 of Genesis 18, and Abraham drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. And Abraham, little by little, began to negotiate with God and work down until if there was 10 righteous, God would spare the city. That would be Lot and his wife. And we know there were at least 3 daughters. 2 daughters got out of town with him, and at least 1 daughter died in the city, and a couple of married kids. And so to get 10 wasn't going to be that hard, but there weren't 10. But he negotiated. He was interceding on his behalf. Look over at Psalms 106, Psalms 106. I'm going the wrong way. Psalms 106. And we think about this thing of interceding and caring about others. We're supposed to pray for one another. We're supposed to, we should pray for the sick. We should pray for our widows and those that are in affliction, for the fatherless. There ought to be in our heart a concern and to pray for one another and to intercede, to go into God's presence on behalf of another. And so in Psalms 106, down at verse 21, they forgot God, their Savior, which had done great things in Egypt, wonderful works in the land of Ham, and terrible things by the Red Sea. Therefore, he said that he would destroy them. I'm in Psalms 106, verse 23. Therefore, he said that he would destroy them, had not Moses, his chosen, stood before him in the breach to turn away his wrath, lest he should destroy them. And so God was ready to destroy Israel, and Moses stood between Israel and God, and he interceded. And I hope you'll take time to intercede. And in both these cases, Lot and Israel, they were backslidden. They were in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. Let's just don't intercede for the good and the godly. Let's intercede for the backslidden and the broken and the hurting. That person struggling with drugs, that person who their world has fallen apart, they've gotten out of church or whatever it might be. The ministry of intercession is huge, just a huge thing. If you go over to Ezekiel 22, Ezekiel chapter 22, and there's quite a few verses like this in the Bible, and I'm just picking out a few of them. But in Ezekiel 22 and verse 30, again, the ministry of Ezekiel was to Israel when they were Judah, the southern half of Israel, as they were going to be condemned, they were going to be destroyed, and little by little they were killed and carried away captive. And Ezekiel was part of the captivity, being carried to Babylon. Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem and ended up in Egypt with some of the Jews that were left, the poorest of the poor. But Ezekiel went with the affluent, with the craftsmen, and went to Egypt or to Babylon in captivity. And so in verse 30, Ezekiel's preaching to a people still the last warnings before the final judgment of God fell. And again, see, they would come in, an army would come in and lay siege, maybe for a year, and they'd capture people and they'd cause havoc and they'd keep the people from farming their land. They'd cause poverty and hurt and economic stress. And they might leave and they'd come back. There were at least, on 2 or 3 different times Babylon came in. And finally the city fell and people were killed by the multitudes. A very tragic story. But the people, Deuteronomy warned from Deuteronomy 28, God said, if you worship other gods, you get away from me, I will destroy you. And it's a promise from God. And so in Deuteronomy 22, verse 30, he says, I sought for a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found none. And so God says, I have a desire to save you. And I'm looking for a man, one or a group of people who would pray for their country and intercede for their country, that God would not destroy the land. But he said, I didn't find any. I just didn't find anybody that cared. And thinking about America and the mess that our country is in, if you want to go back between Isaiah, from Ezekiel, where we were, go a little before to Jeremiah chapter 5. But I think about our country and the needs in America. And don't you see the hurt our country's in, and the lies and the deceitfulness and the corruption, and it ought to hurt us. Now, it ought not hurt us so that we hate our country. It ought to hurt us so we intercede for our country. We ought to hate the wrong, but we ought to love the land. This is our home. And by the way, America is the place that God has used to put more missionaries in the world, to put more money into the mission field, to put more gospel tracts, more printed Bibles printed. America, at one point it was England. But the last many 100 years or more, 150 years, America has been the place pushing money and Bibles and Christian literature, and then young people, sending our young across the world. America's been the place to send the gospel to the lost world. And for that, I ask God for mercy on our country. And I want our country to be spared. Like another generation, I think my son is just starting to raise support to go to Trinidad. I want him to get the support he needs and all this COVID nonsense to go away, and him to be able to get to the mission field. And I want our teenagers that have surrendered their life to serve God to be able to get to college and get to the mission field. One of our boys, Nathan Patton, and his wife Marissa are out gathering support, and that they too might find their way to the Philippines. And many of our missionaries that are home can't get to the field. It's very awkward right now. One of our missionaries, you have to keep renewing your visa. Well, his visa's he's overstayed his visa because of COVID. They were locked in their community. They couldn't go to the capital to renew their visas, so they're here. And now if they do get permission to leave the country to come back to the States, because they've overstayed their visas, they're not sure they'll get back into the country. And they've got a church and a home and a college and all the ministries. Our missionaries are facing some very awkward and question, in their mind, what do I do? Now, we know God's got a plan, but we don't know what it is. And so that's why you intercede for our missionaries and you intercede for your country. And so in Jeremiah chapter 5, you look there with me, Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 1, run you to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and see now and know, and seek in the broad places thereof. If you can find a man, if there be any that executeth judgment, that seeketh the truth, and I'll pardon it. And God's kind of throwing the challenge. Find me anybody in this town who's really longing for righteousness and desirous of doing right. Find them. Go ahead. Find them for me. And I'll pardon the country. I'll pardon the city. But you've got to show me somebody. You've got to show me somebody who cares. And all that to be said, not just for America, but for the Philippines, for Mexico, for Trinidad, for Brazil, for Ecuador, around the country and around the world, to intercede is when you stop. And that's why in our bulletin, I don't have a bulletin in front of me here, but in our bulletin, well, here I've got this is from my Sunday school class, a handout, and we've got some prayer requests. And so what are these here for? So that when you're home and you've got some time quiet, you go to God and you intercede on behalf of this person or this group of people or this ministry, and invest. Most of us, we're pretty well off. We home, car, house, clothes, plenty of food, and if we need something, we got doctors. If we can't get, if there's an emergency, we call 911. Someone comes and helps us, and we are really spoiled. But you understand, there are 7 billion people in this world, and there's only 320 million or 330 million, something like that, in America. And out of 7 billion, there's 300 million and I'm not for distribution of wealth. I'm not for the government taking what we have and taking it away. And I'm not for destroying America, making us a third world country like a lot of these dictator type socialist and communist leaders would like to. Our leaders right now, they'd love nothing more than to impoverish the nation, to get them very wealthy, to get us very poor, so they could rule over us. And by the way, as a child of God, at least we know we're servants of the King. But I don't want to lose our country. But to intercede, realizing that most of the world, they'll never have what you and I have. And they'll never have the job you have with the hourly wage or the pension or the retirement or Social Security or whatever. And man, we are so blessed. And when you bow your head to pray and thank God for what he's given you, would you intercede specifically? Think of one of our missionaries. Think of Jonathan Fisher. I got a letter from him the last day or two up in Alaska. Pray for he and his wife and their little babies. And they're reaching into these villages in Alaska, up these little rivers, up into the rural areas. And there's churches in Anchorage and Fairbanks and all, but you go back into the back country and there's not churches. And Jonathan and his wife they need interceded for. We need to pray for their blessings, pray for their health, their safety, pray that God would open the hearts of the people. We have so many great people out serving God around the world, but even around our country, as people are starting churches. So intercession, pray for one another, pray for your church, for your state, for your country. Pray specifically for some missionaries. Kevin Wynn down in Mexico, he's my age, and you spend your lifetime in a third world country, it ages you. And there's pressures. Larry Owens down in Argentina, he was in school with me, been there all these years, and lost his wife to cancer. And so he's down there and remarried now, but he's older, and he's got some needs. And so pray for these missionaries, and they have burdens and they have troubles. And just like our Baptist brethren back years ago in America, the rest of the world is in this kind of a culture, and we are headed back to it. So pray for one another and ask God's blessing. Hope you have a great day, and be praying for our weekend, if you would, that God would richly bless the soul winning on Saturday and all that goes on Sunday.